He claims to be Clark Rockefeller.
Police say Rockefeller is known to use a number of different aliases.
The man who calls himself Clark Rockefeller.
The man who calls himself Clark Rockefeller.
When Clark Rockefeller walked into court today to hear his fate, he smirked a bit. During the week-long trial and days of jury deliberations, it has proved an elusive exercise unraveling who this man truly is. For decades, he fooled nearly everyone in his path with tall tales of affluence and power.
He said that he was a ship's captain in South America.
He was going to be appointed to the Federal Reserve Board.
He told me he was working at Harvard.
He told me that he had quite a lot of money.
People were blaming him for the failure of the Asian financial markets.
Whom do you know that individual to be?
Clark Rockefeller.
I met him as Clark Rockefeller.
Clark Rockefeller told a lot of people that he was a member of the iconic American family famous for wealth and philanthropy.
The world's richest sportsman tees off.
So when news broke last summer that a Rockefeller may have kidnapped his daughter,
Clark Rockefeller allegedly grabbed his daughter Ray during a supervised visit in Boston and then fled in this SUV to New York.
It stirred a worldwide frenzy.
Police now say they believe he may be trying to flee to Bermuda or
Mystery
Peru.
surrounding this man. Take a look at this picture, please. He claims to be Clark Rockefeller, but now he is the subject of a manhunt.
It was soon revealed Clark Rockefeller was not part of the oil dynasty. He was really just Christian Karl Gerhardtstreiter from Bavaria, Germany. But he used the Rockefeller name to spin a web of lies.
He said he was somehow involved in the investment business.
He said he was an entrepreneur and he was losing a few million in some deal.
During the week-long kidnapping trial, witnesses said he was obsessed with the finer things in life.
He made a big effort of borrowing some expensive jewelry from his family, he said.
The defense argued Rockefeller's bizarre behavior all added up to a case of insanity. The prosecution claimed he's just a con man. Former prosecutor Beth Karras has followed the trial from the beginning.
He is one of the most interesting defendants that I've ever covered, and I don't want to tell you how many years.
The jury had to decide if Rockefeller was crazy or just calculating when he took his 7-year-old daughter Ray last July during a supervised visit in Boston. Rockefeller's ex-wife, Sandra Boss, made this emotional plea.
Please, please, bring Snooks back. There has to be a better way for us to solve our differences than this way.
After 6 days on the run, authorities finally caught up with them in Baltimore. The tip on Rockefeller's whereabouts came from realtor Julie Gochar, one of the first witnesses to take the stand for the prosecution.
What is the name by which you know him?
Chip Smith.
How did you first come into contact with him?
Through email correspondence.
You know, he was always very proper and chipper, but seeing him there, he looked so different, and I used the word deflated, you know, like the ego and the arrogance that was once there was just gone.
He told Gochar he was sailing from Chile to Baltimore and was looking to buy a home.
He prepared me for the fact that he wasn't going to be tan because his trip was spent mostly in the rain.
What do you mean he prepared you for that?
In his communication, couldn't believe that he had been sailing for as long as he had and doesn't have a tan to show for it.
Rockefeller said he had a 7-year-old daughter named Muffy.
The mother was a surrogate, and that he would had destroyed the papers on her identity.
Gochar told the jury how she met with Rockefeller daily to show him properties. He was even picky about the name of the street. After an exhaustive search, he chose this secluded carriage house.
There's no way he's going to go for it. It's on Pulley Street. Who would want to live on Pulley Street? And he chuckled and said, "That's perfect." You know, and looking back on it now, it's kind of borderline creepy.
Trying to develop as much information as we can.
Soon after, she was stunned to see her client's photo on the news.
At that point, the whole idea of Chip Smith was gone. I had no idea what this man was capable of.
She called the authorities.
We were out showing the FBI where we knew his home to be, where we knew his boat to be, where we thought he may be hanging out.
The FBI had the harbor master lie to Rockefeller that his boat was sinking. He rushed to save it, and the con man was conned. Following the arrest, he was interviewed by the authorities. It would be the only time the jury would hear from Rockefeller himself.
Where were you born?
Well, as far as I know, New York.
Okay, can you explain that a little bit to me? Because I know where I was born, you know, I'm sure this detective does, and I'm just a little bit curious about that.
I'm not totally clear on that. It could have actually been Boston, too.
Okay. Well, it's kind of a difference. I'm just,
I know.
you know, I hate to harp on the point, but it just seems kind of like a basic thing.
Next to the stand, prosecutors called Daryl Hopkins, a chauffeur who became the unsuspecting getaway driver.
I just understood that he was Clark Rockefeller of the Rockefeller family.
Hopkins believed he was a worldly trust fund baby.
He was always dressed extremely prep. You know, pants with the little whales all over them.
He even compared him to one of television's most eccentric millionaires.
How would you describe his manner of speaking, his accent, if you will?
In the veneer of Thurston Howell III, if you will.
From Gilligan's Island?
From Gilligan's Island.
Poor Thurston, you do have problems.
It is rather difficult being rich. If it weren't for the money, I'd rather be poor.
And in a moment made for a sitcom, Hopkins told the jury what Rockefeller had ordered for lunch.
Steak tartare.
The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he dressed, his address, where his daughter was going to school, it all fit. He's a Rockefeller, he doesn't have to work, he's just raising his child.
Hopkins was paid $3,000 to pick up the father and daughter and ditch the man he was told was a clingy relative. It was actually the social worker supervising the visit.
I saw a black SUV with the door open.
I dropped it into drive to drive off. I didn't think the guy was going to run alongside the car and, you know, try to open the door, but he did, so I just drove a little faster and off we went.
But after Hopkins dropped them off, he heard an Amber Alert that would change his life.
Boston, she is believed to be in danger and may be traveling with Clark Rockefeller.
All I had to hear was Clark Rockefeller, and my world collapsed.
In a black Chevrolet Tahoe or GMC Yukon.
What do you mean?
Because he had kidnapped his daughter, and I was the getaway car.
Rockefeller and Ray were on the run, and a mother's worst nightmare was just beginning. The prosecution's star witness, Sandra Boss, finally took the stand and relived the terrifying 6 days without her daughter.
I was completely traumatized. I was hysterical. I was just, you know, devastated. There's really no way to describe it. It was horrible.
But it was her history with Rockefeller the prosecution was most interested in. Boss told the jury they met at a Clue board game party.
Well, I was supposed to be Miss Scarlet, and so I wore a red scarf.
How was he in character?
He was Professor Plum, and he wore some maroon-colored corduroy trousers.
Professor Plum was just one of his many fictitious characters. The one Boss fell in love with was Clark Rockefeller, a descendant of the oil tycoon. She said money drove her husband, and when her $2 million a year salary wasn't enough, he became controlling.
He wanted to walk me to and from work every day. The defendant declined to provide me with enough to eat.
I see. So you were starving in New Hampshire.
I woke up hungry most nights.
You're making $40,000 a week, and you're telling us that he was so controlling of you that you did not know what you had in the bank, you didn't know the passwords to your accounts, you went to bed hungry because she says the defendant wasn't feeding her enough. It was kind of hard to fathom.
That created an opening for the defense that focused on the outlandish stories he told Boss about his life as a rocket scientist, a 14-year-old freshman at Yale, even the disorder that left him mute as a child.
After not having spoken for whatever it was, 8 years, 10 years, one day he saw a dog, and the first words he uttered in that decade were woofness, and at that point he was able to speak after that?
He told me that.
Okay. Does that seem remotely credible to you?
It did at the time. I mean, I didn't care. He was a kid.
They grilled Boss for hours, trying to understand how a Harvard-educated business consultant could believe his lies.
I mean, I'm not saying that I made a very good choice of husband. I mean, it's pretty obvious that I had a blind spot. All I'm saying is that it is possible that one can be brilliant and amazing in one area of one's life and be really stupid in another.
After 12 years, she finally asked for a divorce. The prosecution called 16 witnesses in all. The defense called just 2, a pair of doctors who believe Rockefeller is delusional.
If there is a continuum of narcissistic personality disorder, he is on the far end of the continuum.
Dr. Catherine House said Rockefeller's mental state is like nothing she'd ever seen, but the prosecution fought back.
In this huge book full of diagnostic criteria and diagnoses, it's your view that this man stands alone as a diagnosis unto himself?
I think there's something more. And as you know, if you speak to any professional, we use it as a guideline.
There's no diagnosis in here for liar, is there?
There's nothing under that word, no.
Next up, TV psychiatrist Keith Abloh, who testified that Rockefeller has lost touch with reality.
Mr. Rockefeller migrated into a true delusional state in which he actually believed that these things about him were true.
But prosecutors pressed Abloh, putting into question whether Rockefeller's far-fetched stories were delusions or simply lies.
Those witnesses said that the more people around him believed his delusions and believed he was a Rockefeller, the deeper he got into his delusional disorder, the more severe it got. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it makes sense.
How hard is it to prove insanity in a case like this?
It's a very difficult defense. The law will recognize that a person is mentally ill, but for them not to be criminally responsible, they really have to be out of their heads.
On the sixth day of the case, the defense and prosecution presented their closing arguments.
Don't let this insanity defense be the culminating manipulation in a lifetime of lies designed to try to get what he wanted. Don't shy away from the facts.
This is not a man playing with a whole deck. Pure madness. You see him descending into a madness.
All right.
But there were 12 men and women Rockefeller couldn't fool with his insanity defense, the jury.
We, the jury, say that the defendant is guilty of offenses charged.
Rockefeller was found guilty on kidnapping and assault and battery charges. The young jury took 4 days to reach its verdict.
This was a complicated case, and not as clear-cut as it might seem to those who have followed it only in the media.
The defendant was, however, found not guilty on providing a false name to law enforcement, and he still believes he is Clark Rockefeller.
I have no reason to believe it was anything other than a fair trial that was considered very carefully by a very diligent jury.
So the man with so many aliases will soon be known as just a number in state prison,
The defendant displayed no regard for the rule of law,
where he now faces up to 5 years in an 8x10 cell, replacing steak tartare with meatloaf. I'm Andrea Canning for Nightline in Boston.